Okay, I'd like to welcome you all to this week's edition of the Belonging series, exploring the BAME experience. And this week we have the pleasure of having Moonlie Whittaker with us, and we're going to discuss her experiences of the various aspects of her life story so far in terms of working with staff and students in the learning, development and coordination process. And she's also worked on a project which was related to the BAME Attainment Gap. So I know that we've got quite a good conversation which we're going to have with Moonlie now. Could I just remind everyone to turn off their, to mute their microphones, please, and turn off their cameras. Okay. Okay, let's begin. I might have a bit of background noise in the background because there's it's just very noisy outside today for some reason. Right, so Moonlie, I'd like to welcome you this morning, and I'd like to just kick off by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself, and yeah, tell us a bit about yourself, please.
Okay, so I'm Moonlie. I work in the LDC as a Learning Development Coordinator. I've joined Imperial almost a year ago in July. Before that, I've worked for 6 different other universities. Most of them were always student-facing. This is the first time that's staff-facing. So I've worked at SOAS, Queen Mary, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, King's College, University of the Arts, and Greenwich. Some of the stuff I've done, especially the last one at Greenwich, was BAME, looking after the BAME Attainment Gap project. Myself, I am actually Dutch, but I grew up in Belgium. And my parents, I identify myself more as Chinese Malaysian, really.
Right. Okay, that's brilliant to know. So anyone who had just tuned in would have not have known that you were Dutch or that you grew up in Belgium. Yeah. Until we investigate, we can't tell. All right. Until we investigate that story, we can't tell. All right. Yeah. We would have made other assertions based on characteristics which don't always tell the true story. So you also mentioned that you'd worked with a number of universities. So SOAS, Greenwich, King's College, University of Arts, as well as London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, both in student-facing roles and also in student-facing roles, but also in staff-facing roles. So I'm going to ask a little bit about what it is that you've done in both of those roles, and how would you compare and contrast those different roles which you've had?
So in both roles, so I found in my roles I'm always drawn to supporting learning and teaching. And I think that's why I like to enjoy at universities, because of course it's a place of education. And I think I mean, if you know me, I love learning. I'm very curious. And for me to support that for students, especially like making it more easier or accessible and making it less scary. And I think that's something I always try to carry out in my current role, is to make learning, I'll try to make myself very approachable as well to the people I'm helping with. They can ask me any questions. And sometimes I get copied an email that I'm like, I'm not the first point of contact for this. It's like, I don't mind. And it's like, oh, I can refer you to the other services. The contrast is again like, you know, one is like student facing, the other one is staff facing. I've got a lot to learn about learning and development and HR kind of perspective. But there are some similarities that in terms of work, sometimes it can be very demanding. You know, sometimes that you can feel a bit underappreciated as well. And it's not just me, but I also see that in my colleagues, especially in my previous institutions.
Yeah. So you mentioned about the fact that one, you can feel a little bit unappreciated at times, and that, but you like to be in your role as student facing, or whether it's staff facing, you like to be approachable. How do you make that happen? What would you do to ensure that people find you approachable?
Well, like for example, I mean, I've worked in different workplaces before, and sometimes they really not, you know, it's like sometimes for students, like when they're thinking about teaching and learning, they always focus on, okay, that's actually done by the lecturer or the teacher and the students. It's like it happens within the classroom. However, they don't think that there's a bit of a power thing, that students don't think lecturers are very approachable.
Right. Yeah.
You know, they could be quite scared, or sometimes they don't have time. You know, especially if you're sitting in a lecture theatre of like 70 people, and then, you know, it's really hard for the lecturer, you know, to have contact with them. And the same with the course director as well. So they will come to the course administrator and say, like, actually, you know, can you help me with this? And how I make myself approachable is like, well, I always answer the emails. I always like make it very informal. You know, I would never, I try to change my tone in emails, like very informal. So you can ask me any questions. I also act, you know, a bit silly, like sometimes I share like cat pictures with my students. You know, that kind of changed the tone a bit.
Yeah.
And for me, it would be like, okay, I would work and then highlight the problems to the course director, really.
Right. So you're a conduit. You're a linchpin in for when you were doing your student facing role. You were the one who was kind of like helping to keep everything turning, keeping it going, keeping the students happy, but also making sure that the academic staff also then felt that they
also
knew
like
what was going on.
engaged. Yeah. So that in a way they're engaged, they know what's going on. Because sometimes, you know, the students can be hard to track.
Right.
You know, sometimes they disappear, or yeah, and I'll be like, you know, the first one to know what's going on, or I would able to track down who they needed to contact.
So I'm going to come back to that point then, because from what you're saying, it's one of the things which you said was that you were very good. You were approachable. Students would contact you. You'd make sure the course is running smoothly, running efficiently, but yet in many ways you felt unappreciated. What was, not just yourself, but I'm not just pinning it on you, but what was, why did you feel unappreciated, or what was it that made you feel as though you weren't appreciated for what you were doing?
I think at one place that I worked for, they told all the course administrators that we were replaceable by computers. That we, you know, or the fact that, or there's another workplace I worked for where I had to organize workshops as well. And they just pin like, oh, you're the administrator. Here's all the admin. You know, and I end up scheduling like 800 workshops, as well as trying to roll out a study skill service for the first time. And there was like and then you can see like a battle between, you know, among the stakeholders trying to fight for my time.
So you made yourself too approachable that everyone wanted to use you.
But I've seen in workplaces where people had to leave, you know, because they couldn't stand it, they didn't feel appreciated. They, you know, in a way, like, it really knocked down the confidence. Like, you know, if they made feel like I don't add any value to the things I'm doing, what's the point?
Right.
And that's also further reflected in, for example, the National Student Survey.
Yeah.
Like, they would only have one question. They would have loads of questions about the different inputs about the student experience, but they only have like one question about the admin, you know, like the administration of the university. And they would never like, of course, they would just say very overgeneral, like, oh yeah, there's some issues with Moodle, or, you know, they would just only remember the bad things.
Yeah.
And you're not leaving enough space to say, you know, the course administration, how is it run, you know? And it's very hard to, just a question of like the administration of university, that's really hard to describe in one question. And also, I still need to find, you know, at some other universities, when they talk about learning and teaching strategies, how much of that is actually involves support services.
Right. Expand on that. How do you mean? How does it involve support services?
So, like I said, a lot of people, when you think about learning and teaching, you would think what happens in the classroom.
Right.
And that's between the lecturer and the students, you know, or whoever. But they don't think about what's outside. You know, that could be the course administration, it could be ICT, it could be timetabling, and it could also be estates as well. I sat down with the head of estates planning at one of my previous places, and he had to design a new student, redesign a new student building. And you could see how much thought is actually put into to make sure that the design that he's doing is inclusive by design, and it's also facilitate the learning. What he said is that people, we've moved on because of, you know, technology, and that the learning doesn't really only happen in classrooms. It also happens, like, you know, students catching up in social spaces and can talk about it, and it's enabling those social spaces as well. And I think, I mean, I'm not sure about Imperial, but a lot of places I've worked for, whenever they do learning and teaching strategy, these kind of support services kind of get overlooked.
So you're from what you're saying, it's about the holistic package. So oftentimes, if you want to put it in another way, the lecturers are the key players, and the admin staff are the back room, and nobody really sees or appreciates how much effort it is to put everybody up on that platform. Is that kind of like what you're saying?
I mean, they do include like general stuff like libraries, but even when I've worked in libraries before, they still felt unappreciated. Because in university, you know, I've been to universities, and let's say you can't say you're a leading university if you don't have a really good library. You know?
Or access to really, if your resources within that library doesn't reflect the amount of information which is necessary for the students. I'd agree with that.
Like, for example, you know, I went to SOAS as a student, and then the research library is like, oh my God, it's like a dream. It's one of the 5 national research libraries, and it's like, you can get lost in there. And I worked for a different university where they're trying to have their own Chinese department. And I, you know, when I worked there, I was like, okay, I'll just dip in and have a look at the sources, and it's like a shelf. So
you, from what you were saying, you need to have the right tools in place in order to enable you to not only fulfill your role, but also fulfill the role which the university is having for example, for the students and the staff members.
And they kind of forget the social element of it, which is really important, because if you're a student, and I'm pretty sure for staff as well, if you're in a very good place that you feel supported, this is where learning can happen. If you're, I don't know, if you're struggling, and you know, if you're struggling with something or you're stressed, and I know students have that as well, but even with staff members, if you don't feel supported, if you don't feel appreciated, that's going to have an effect about in the entire university experience. You know, for example, with course administrators, I don't know why, but it's just seemed like, okay, you just stick to this role of course administration, you know, just sticking to it, but not even seeing like, well, there actually be partners in creating a really good student experience.
So I like that idea. So it's actually, it's not just about the academic experience which the students have. Again, it's, I keep using this word, but the holistic approach. So it's looking at it from the social aspects, it's looking at it from how you as an administrator and how the academics and the students can forge something which is much more suited for purpose. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, so there's a theory that goes around, and this is when I was working with the head of academic service at the time, and she introduced me the theory of co-creation.
Yeah. So
instead of like the teacher being above the students and thinking like, I am the holder of all the knowledge.
Yeah.
This you know, and instead of like, no, you're putting on an equal field called co-creation. Where both parts take responsibilities in their own learning and teaching. There's a trust between them as well. And you see that when I was working, and you know, when we're trying to roll out study skills services at King's, you see there were a lot of resistance from lecturers, like, oh, you can't trust those students. You know, and or they would say something like, but like we were trying to set up like a peer-to-peer, a peer-assisted scheme, which is very widely popular in America and Sweden, and I think it's still rolling out in the UK. But the idea is that you have like a third-year students guiding a first-year students as kind of a bit of a mentor. And this is, you know, this is where students take responsibility for their own learning. And that also gives like the academic a bit of break as well. But at the same time, it's also trusting them, you know, they can take the learning further. Everyone, you see each other like at an equal thing. And with co-creation, I think it should further expand to professional service as well, that we're seen as equal partners.
Yeah. Could I ask another question? Because I also noticed that you had said that previously you'd worked with, so it's kind of like developing on the theme which you've just been saying, but previously you'd also worked in the BAME Attainment Gap, right? And so here, there is a problem. So your idea of co-creation, right, may be something that needs to be looked at more closely to determine how we can address that issue. So can you give us a little bit about what you did in terms of the BAME Attainment Gap project which you were on?
So the BAME Attainment Gap at Greenwich, so this was great because it was at the same time that I finished my master's at Birkbeck. It was about education, power and social change. And for me to take part in this project was, I've learned so much. Like, you know, you learn through textbooks, but at the first time I can actually apply it and witness it. So the BAME Attainment Gap addresses a long-standing issue in higher education, that there is an attainment gap between white and non-white students. And for this purpose of the project, we only focus on British, UK domiciled. But the problem with that is that people knew what was going on, but they couldn't prove it. It's very hard to prove. And the project that I was working on was in collaboration with Kingston, UCL, Wolverhampton, the Montfort and Hertfordshire. And it was an Office for Student project. So it started with Kingston, who's the leading university, and they developed this metric called the value added metric. I mean, this kind of warrants like a different presentation. But basically, to simplify it, they've found like a really good metric that's already been used by the Guardian,
Mm-hmm.
and it's called a value added,
Mm-hmm.
where you can actually prove that that the expectations of percentage of people getting a good degree and the reality.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens if you separate the cohort into white and non-white is that the whites have been getting, you know, the percent they're getting the expectations, you know, whereas in BAME there's a discrepancy. And what's more interesting, if you go further and apply for different subjects, one subject, especially arts and humanities, they have a really large discrepancy, like BAME not getting the expected degree that they're supposed to get.
Mm-hmm.
But there's fewer so in STEM. There's still a lot of work to do. Yeah,
Sorry, what I was going to ask was, what would you say was based on the results of the study, what would you say would be the next steps that needed to happen in terms of developing strategies towards getting rid of the BAME attainment gap?
I think the first step is always recognition.
Recognition.
We had to campaign, I had to campaign so hard and reach out to very disengaged departments
Mm-hmm.
to say, you have an attainment gap. And then I had to like translate it in a way that they could understand and interpret the statistics.
Mm-hmm.
And for them, it's kind of a wake-up call, because we have applied this data for 5-year historical data.
Right.
And you can see like there's a gap. And trying to, that would always be number one, like engage with all the engage with all the departments, engage with the seniors, engage with you know, people working on it who are in the supporting teaching roles. And then the second, so there's something that Kingston developed is the inclusive curriculum.
Right.
So where they look into assessment, delivery, and I think design as well, and to make sure that's inclusive by nature.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are very radical, like for example, the guy, the director I used to work with, and he was like a head of education department, and he does not believe in exams.
Okay.
You know?
Okay, I like him already.
And especially like, and I kind of have to admit, I don't believe in exams, especially when it comes to essay exams, like you know, that's often implemented in arts and humanities. The third was we also have a thing where we work with students, where they can actually give feedback on the curriculum, like really honest feedback, and not only about focusing on making it inclusive for BAME, but inclusive for everything. You know, if you've got a learning difficulty, or if your first language is in English, and they will look at the curriculum and say, like, you know, why, and they can give really good feedback, like, why is there no pictures of that? Or they focus on the reading list, or you know, they focus on assessment.
So how did that make you, having kind of like looked at the data, how did that make you feel? And you said that you had just kind of finished your masters at the time. I'm not going to ask you what you got, but did you feel that after having done the project, did you think, well, have I got the added value, or have I been disadvantaged? Did you ever feel like that as a result of having done the study?
So in my studies, at the start of our studies, the lecturers quickly introduced to the concept of cultural capital.
Right.
So for those who don't know what cultural capital is, for example, so this comes from the theorist called Pierre Bourdieu, and he's an educational theorist, you can say. Yeah. So I mean, I'm really simplified. It's like 4 years ago since I did that degree. I'm really simplified. You can look him up. But the way he focused on cultural capital is that you have different fields, that we all move in. We have different fields, and you can kind of relate to like different sectors or different, you know, and there's a different capital that you need in order to move on.
Yeah.
So you've got economic capital, symbolic capital, you've got cultural capital, and there's some other twos that I can't really think on the top of my head.
Yeah.
And depending on the fields that you're trying to make a difference or trying to move, that will dictate the capital that you need.
Right. Okay.
So, for example, if you're applying for a mortgage, it doesn't matter who you know, maybe it does, but your financial capital, your economic capital will decide whether you get a mortgage.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And if we're playing it a bit further, like in the arts industry or in education or in career progression, cultural capital is very important. And cultural capital, in effect, is all about, to sum it up, is whether you fit in that culture.
Right. Okay.
And fitting in that culture depends on what you know, what you value, how you speak, how you dress yourself, how you even your body language is important. Your accent, and also like other things like you know, what you own. You know, do you own a Mercedes or do you own something else, or your credentials as well? And that is kind of a way will already make it clear, like whether you are going to be successful or not. And that can have a very detrimental effect on people, especially young children, who like don't have no idea, you know, don't fit into schools, drop out, and kind of like you know, can't feel like they can actually study or make something. But of course, this is very cynical, because in practice you do have students, mature students, who are always going to admire that return to education.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, and that's so admirable, because they're like, well, most of the mature students have experienced really bad school experience, like you know, they didn't fit in, they didn't understand, they didn't know what the teacher wants, they don't know anything, and then years later they return. And as in for me, I kind of, from my own personal experience, I think growing up in Belgium, being the only Chinese, or one of the few Chinese, had I think there was some times I kind of got not discriminated, but had some bias against me. Just by, you know, for example, I'm very forward, and the teacher didn't like it, and you know, for some reason wrote it in my report I have to be more polite, you know. And for me, like, I didn't understand, like, just talk the way I talk. And I think there's a lot of cultural capital. I think I'll mention that example that I mentioned to you yesterday, to really highlight cultural capital. So there's a girl that I used to work with. She was a student at the time, and she's really smart, really intelligent. She's the first in her family to go to King's College and study medicine. She's Black and she's Muslim. And you think like, oh, this is, on paper you think, oh, this is brilliant, this is great, you know, well done her, getting into one of the top Russell Group universities. But in reality, when you think about it, as soon as she stepped in the classroom on day one, and you see a lecture theatre of like 70 people, and on average, a lot of these people come from families, from health professionals. So already from day one, she's already at a disadvantage. And that just highlights like what cultural capital is. Like, it's cultural capital because she wouldn't know how to move into universities because she's the first in her family to go to, whereas other people do. Secondly, she would struggle with writing assessment or essays or exams. Whereas the other one, you know, it's kind of part in when they grow up, they kind of pick up the language, knowing how to speak, knowing how to negotiate, know how to carry forward an argument. And the third one would be like, you know, she wouldn't have any idea, like in terms of career options when she graduates.
Yeah.
Whereas the other people are more likely to have resources. And what happens is, like, you know, these students who don't have the cultural capital, they have to rely on central services, which you all know it's you know, it's always underfunded and
overused. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I like that idea which you were talking about there with regards to the cultural capital and the effect that it can have on students coming in to the university who may be first in generation, who may not have had those other experiences or have access to those other experiences. So thank you for that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to see if there's any questions from the floor. If not, then we'll just carry on, and I've got a few more questions which I would like to ask. But I've seen one from Manjula. If Manjula would like to ask her question, if you unmute yourself.
Yeah, when actually she was talking about that student satisfaction admin work is not included. I was just wondering whether that is covered under organization and management on the NSS. This is regarding the NSS.
I'm not sure. I know, like, some universities, I mean, this is from my experience at a different university, but I know universities have they could add their own questions to the National Student Survey. So I wouldn't know under the case of Imperial. But from my experience, it's always been one question.
Yeah, that's true. I know there are a lot of issues because NSS ask very, some questions are not meaningful. So I think this is something that we need to think about in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you for that question, Manjula. I think William Acker also has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Moonlie. Yeah, I used to teach a bit of those sessions on the education, power and social change actually.
Oh.
Passed it over to somebody, to another colleague of mine to do that. But that's it's a good program. But,
we need to catch up then. Alumni.
And again, similarly, as somebody that's worked on both sides in, say, university administration and now as a lecturer, so I just wanted to ask you that where you found that kind of almost like divorce between the academics and the professional services, and what impact did you think that had on things like the awarding gap and the student experience overall, as well as like personal impact on yourself, having that, and where the relationship was more closer, then is it more beneficial?
I think, like, you know, I think it's really highlighted in the last 10 years, you know, when universities, because of the tuition fee rise, you know, universities has become more marketized, and they are universities that trying to present themselves like businesses as opposed to educational institutions where you're supposed to educate people. And I think that, you know, and you can see, like, they're trying to cut costs, and that impacts in professional services more, because they feel like, well, I don't feel really valued by the things that I can actually bring on the table. You know, you just need someone to go, you know, fill in paperwork, but you're not seeing that actually the learning and teaching that I can bring into the students, that I can make myself indispensable to students. And I feel like the way they view the role, and we all know that a lot of the senior positions are set by, you know, academic people, you know, and these are the people that are making choices. and they would just see on paper like, okay, you're an administrator or coordinator, and it doesn't have to be course administrator. It could be like in library services, it could be ICT, it could be even cleaning even, you know, and they don't see the value that you can bring into like trying to create a community, that you feel like you're a part of. And a lot of universities, sadly, they're all trying to be the #1 university. They're all trying to be the next Imperial College. They're all trying to be the next Russell Group universities. And there's some kind of like, I don't know, some kind of break of like losing vision of what's really important, is that this is a place for education. You know, this is a place where people are supposed to be learning, and I feel like the last 10 years it's you know, it's kind of got lost, and you can justify it because, you know, it is marketized in the last decade. For me personally, I mean, I've seen so many places, you know, because your role, especially in support services, you kind of get underappreciated for the things that you can make a difference, and you don't have to be directly involved in students. You know, you could be an office coordinator. You know, still your role is still important to the running of the university, because without you, people will have to spend more time trying to do your job. And the reason why you're here employed is because you're there to solve a problem, and that saves time on their hand, you know, whether it's like processing finance or, you know, raise POs and stuff. And I've worked, sadly, I have worked with a couple of places that I felt like I had to leave. Because, you know, because the position that they were in, they put me under, I had to leave. And it wasn't just me. After I've left, I know for one workplace, they had to fill in that role like 20 times in 1 year. And they just feel like, I feel like they just don't get it. And you can say it's mismanagement, but because of the mismanagement and no one wants to address it, it will have an impact. And students will be like, well, I thought Moonlie was our course administrator, and now it's this. So there's no consistency.
Good, very good question, and very good point there, Moonlie. I believe that Medina Wade has a question. Medina, if you could come in with your question.
Hi, yeah, thanks Wayne, and thanks Moonlie for the talk. It's really interesting to hear about more of the behind the scenes aspects of education. I was wondering, when you were working on the BAME Attainment Gap project, did you find that getting data from different universities was easy, or did you struggle to get that information? Because from what I've seen, there seems to be kind of, some universities have a lot of data, others don't have so much. So just wondering what your experience was with that.
So from my experience, I'm not a data analyst. So I would say the data is already available. If you check on HEFCE, HESA, the Higher Education Statistics Agency, they should have that data already. But it's the methodology that makes it unique, and that's the value added. So they would apply on a data set that's already there, but you just need to have an expert data analyst who kind of convert that data into meaningful, what is known as the value added data. And that's a very specific methodology that they were using, and it's already been used by the Guardian League Table called, you know, I think the Guardian League Table must have gone out now, but there's different metric that they score, and one of them is the VA, called the value added. And the value added goes, is underlying your previous experience, like whatever subject you were studying, and whether it's met with the industry and how it benchmarks against the rest of the sector. The data is already there. People just don't know. It's just putting a puzzle together, if you know what I mean. Like A and B and get the value added. But I'm happy to talk with you separately, explaining, how, you know, how it looks like the value added. But yeah, it's something that university can start applying. They just need to be shown how. But in terms of getting the value added, you know, I think some universities like Kingston and Greenwich have already put out there what the attainment gap is. And it's quite shocking that, you know, Kingston, at a very different university than Greenwich, they're showing patterns of a similar thing, like consistent patterns.
So between the two universities, I just want to follow up on that point. So between the two universities, even though they're quite different in their remit and etc., you were seeing that the data was showing that they were very similar.
There's always an attainment gap for BAME, that, you know, and they showed like for the last 5 years, there's always something, and this is at institutional level.
Yeah.
You know, that's and I know some universities like Greenwich, they just show you the institutional level, but when you get access and you show the breakdown by faculties and departments,
yeah,
that's where it gets really interesting, and
yeah,
you see it applying for the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And this is what I also kind of argue for subject-specific issues.
Yeah.
Because what we forget in teaching and learning strategy is this: we forget to address the subject-specific culture.
Yeah.
Like for some subjects that you study, like law and economics and paramedic, they tend to be very white male focus, and you can even say that each subject has its own culture. Other subjects like nursing or languages, you attract more female students or female lecturers as well. And each subject that you do has its own culture, and you need to recognize that as well. And also recognize that each subject that you do have its own language. There's a whole field called, what's it called? Academic literacy.
Yeah.
It's a linguistic study about if they do like a linguistic comparison, that's how you write for a business essay. It's going to be completely different how you write for engineering.
Yeah.
You know, the way you carry forward an argument is expressed very differently, despite being all of them in English. You know, and I think that's what one of the things that students struggle. They don't get, like, there's a specific language you need to speak. And what you get from lecturers sometimes, they get this really like generalization, like, oh, they don't know critical thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And it's like, actually they do, like they do know critical thinking, but not in the language you require them to do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting that you should say that, because it's then kind of like could link some of the ideas around when you said there was two different institutions. I'd really be interested in finding out how the other institutions also panned out, because if we think about the idea of institutionalized racism, etc., and it's a problem which is across the entire sector, if everybody is looking, as you said, to be the next number one or the next Russell Group university, then they will adopt similar practices from each other, and they will put the same kind of structures in place, which can be very detrimental for the students themselves.
Yeah, like for BElanna University, they were trying to, you know, like that university was quite known to, you know, well, it was a bit similar to Birkbeck. Birkbeck has its niche, right? It has a niche because it attracts adult learning who can't study at you know, during the daytime. That's why I chose Birkbeck, and I'm pretty sure William must have chosen that as well. And there's a reason why people go to that particular university is because, well, they don't actually want to go to Russell Group University. They don't want that. They want to get a qualification, you know, they want to, and what happens is that some universities, they actually increase the entry requirements. You know, they will increase the UCAS points. And what happened is like, well, first of all, if you're an A-star student, would you go to that university?
Yeah.
Or would you go to Russell Group University? You know,
Yeah.
And what happens is like the other students, they don't get catered for. Like,
Yeah.
well, you know, my hope was to go to X, Y, and Z because, you know, and some people don't want to go to Roster Group, you know, because there's a lot of because of
Yeah.
institution, you know, racism, and they feel
Yeah.
more welcome at other universities.
Yeah.
But if they're already excluded from it,
Yeah. Your story has been fascinating in looking at the various different intersects which you have, i.e. between being a student, between having a student facing role, having a staff facing role, and then evaluating all of those different components and getting an idea of what we need to do next. What I'm going to ask, and this is the question I try to ask everyone at the end of the conversation, is if you had advice to your younger self, what would that advice be?
I don't know.
You don't know?
What would be the young? Let me think about this. What would be I think, you know, it might sound a bit cliche, but be proud of the work that you do.
Right.
You know, always deliver good work. Because there were so many times, especially at university, some universities I've worked, you know, where I felt, you know, what I'm doing doesn't matter. I'm replaceable. I'm disposable. And I've seen people, you know, it really, in some cases, it's also knocked down my confidence. You know, I feel like I'm just doing admin. I'm just doing admin.
Yeah.
And it's actually, no, the work that I'm doing requires a very specific skills. Even though we're all administration and support services, it still requires a very specific skill. I can't go and do research administration.
Yeah.
You know, I can't do clinical trials. You know, I can't do that. Or I can't even do quality assurance. I've done that. I can't do it.
Yeah.
You know, it's so policy heavy. You know, I can't do it.
Yeah.
And that requires a very specific skills to do that.
Yeah.
What you see in cases in universities a lot is that when they create roles, they think about, okay, a bit of this, a bit of PA, a bit of operation, a bit of like project management, a bit of this. Whereas actually, if you go to places like America, project management is a separate skill. You require a different purpose. Operation is a separate skill. Finance requires a special skill. So you get really individual roles, and they are seen as a profession on its own right.
Yeah.
Whereas here I found in higher education, as they're kind of like,
They cherry pick little bits.
Yeah. And it's like, oh, it's administration.
Yeah.
So I think, really be proud of yourself, I suppose, like what you do that no one else can do. And from the outside, it might seem the same, like, oh, it's just admin, it's just organizing. But actually, it's not. You still need to have knowledge and expertise with that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Moonlie. That was excellent. And what we're going to do is just advertise for next week. And so for next week, let me just pull up the pictures. We will be having, I'm not even sure how I can I'm going to just call him. We're going to be having Paul Brown, MBE, who is the Mechanical Instrumentation Workshop Manager here at Imperial. So he's going to be our guest next week. And I want to just say thank you again to all of those who tuned in. And thank you for coming to the Belonging series. I'll see you again next week, 12:30.
Thanks for having me, Wayne.
Thank you. Let me just stop the recording just a minute.